gameplay mechanics are some of the hardest things to quantify inside of a game, and what you're going to be doing with them and how they're going to work. So what the gameplay mechanics essentially are is the abilities that your character can perform, the player character, as well as what the enemies are allowed to do in the game, as well as how the world actually works. So all of that has to be decided before you really get to work, and then you start iterating on those processes as you go through them. So like this is Gears of War 5, so you're looking at just some of the characters and how they're moving around. So a couple of the mechanics we can look at right now are just general ability to move, right? So our characters can move up and down. They can move up and down, or forwards and backwards. They can strafe left and right. And then you use the right stick to obviously kind of turn your camera and aim. So this is how pretty much the game works. And you can see right there they did a zoom to fire by holding left trigger. So that's another mechanic. So these are the things that you kind of have to figure out for yourself and decide what the mechanics in your game are going to be. This will be your largest section, and it will also be the hardest section to do. So this requires you to sit down and break your game apart. So if we're looking at Gears of War, again, we have some basic options, and I just queued up the video to grab from. So you can see that this new mechanic, he can actually send back to him, or not armor, but ammo. He can also get weapons, he can get secrets, stuff like that as you play through the game. So this game actually has some new mechanics the other Gears didn't, especially when it comes to the robot. You can actually upgrade the robot to do different things and use him in different ways during combat. And that's one of the most important things, is how do all of these things work together, and you kind of try to figure that out as well as chaining them together. Like, so this situation I'm going to use this, this, and this. So you can see he's walking up here and he's got a chainsaw through these wires to keep going forward. And that would technically be a mechanic, right? Because that required a player input, that required the player to perform an action to continue further. So that is a full mechanic. I'll go ahead and fast forward a little more. Okay, so here they're fighting the swarm. So you can see in these mechanics where he's actually popping into cover and out of cover. So we start looking at more mechanics in that he can run, he can slap into cover, he can roll, he can blind fire. So these are all things that have to be figured out, and then as you make the game, you'll iterate on them and decide, like, okay, blind firing, is this accurate, etc., etc. So you play it enough to figure out what feels good and what requires change, and this takes a very long process. So in your game design document, you're going off of your gut. You're going, you know what, I think this is what's going to be fun. I think this is what people are going to like. And then you'll actually test that as you work on the game, so you don't have to stress too much about iteration right now. So you can see he picked up weapons, so he's swapping weapons. Right now he's carrying 3 weapons. He's carrying 2 main weapons and then a pistol. And then here's like another player action. So to get further, he has to work with Kate to lift the grate. He's telling his robot to pulse right now, which is a different mechanic, and that allows him to see where enemies are and stuff. So he was checking to make sure it was safe before he went down there. And then, of course, this is them lifting up the grate and then walking through. So these are kind of interspersed cutscenes throughout the game. A cutscene does not necessarily come down as a mechanic, since there's no real player action during them, unless you're playing like something like Until Dawn or something like that, to where pretty much the entire game is a cutscene where you're making actions during it, where you're making decisions during that game. So here we're switching to Doom 2016 to look at some of the very quick gameplay mechanics that it has. So obviously the game begins, you kind of wake up, you don't know pretty much what's going on. So this is a non-player control cutscene where the Doom Marine busts out and just wrecks this guy's face. Okay, so then we have weapon handling, right? So we obviously have just standard kind of first-person shooters. I can shoot a weapon. He has a melee attack, which you just saw right there. Now, what's interesting about Doom is they have alt fires on the guns, so not all guns can be zoomed in to fire. So you can see he's kind of triggered this past cutscene that he triggered, and he's watching and participating in.
We have to contain.
And this is kind of how they piecemeal the story through this game, is by doing that. So there he is. He's using right stick as his main input mechanic. He's picking up the armor. When he picks up the armor, again, triggers a cutscene. And then literally the rest of the story in this game you can almost entirely ignore, which is fine, because that's Doom and that's how it works. So I put it on. And this is a great representation of the character, to where he's kind of looking at something and he's trying to figure out what's going on, where he needs to go. So it's telling him there's the error. Demonic presence. Of course, everyone knows the story of Doom, where the hell opens up on Mars and comes in, and the Doom Marine has to fight them.
Welcome. I'm Dr. Savage.
And then more stories kind of dished out this way through these voice recordings.
Together and resolve this problem in a way that benefits.
And the Doom Marine doesn't care. And here we go. So he's looking at his menu system. In the menu system, he can start looking at his weapons. He can look at the artifacts he's found. It gives you a whole bunch of background information about each item, which is really cool. But again, something you can entirely ignore. So there's a mechanic that's the main mechanic of Doom, which is that end hit right there. So whenever an enemy is flashing, you can walk up and hit right stick on them. And that causes you to do like a gory kill, essentially. But doing the gory kill allows them to drop weapons, as well as ammo or health, depending on who you're killing. So now he's got a shotgun. And again, so there's another mechanic, is I have my weapon wheel. However, in Doom, they kind of went back to the old style, to where he pretty much holds however many guns he wants to hold. It doesn't matter, and then you can just switch between them. So now here's an enemy mechanic in that this guy can throw fireballs, right? However, what's really cool about Doom is these fireballs are kind of physics-based, so they can actually be like shifted by actions that are happening off the characters. Like if the character's throwing it but gets shot, it throws the aim off. Here's another mechanic, and that's like a heart chamber type thing, and that's what's kind of allowing this demonic presence to occur. So he has to blow that thing up, which he just did. He just crushed whatever was inside of it. Which ended up killing it, which will then allow him to move on, right? So that's kind of one of the little like mechanics they have, is it's like a kind of stop mechanic, to where you walk into a room, that kind of forces an arena type encounter, to where I'm gonna have to fight all of these guys before I can move on, and then I can move on. And so that's kind of how some of the combat in Doom works. So if we start looking at a different type of game entirely, like a fighting game. So both Gears of War and Doom were shooters, right? So they had kind of standard shooting mechanics. So I can aim, I can shoot, right? Pretty simple. Where Doom is different than Gears is that it's a first-person shooter, while Gears is a third-person shooter. So here's a fighting game. This is Street Fighter V. Fighting game mechanics are probably some of the hardest mechanics you can even think about putting together. And they require you to really think out an entire priority system and everything before you can start testing, and then of course obviously everything can be tweaked from there. But so like we have Ryu and Sagat fighting right now, so you can see that each character has their own special moves, and then they also have different height values and different damage values, and of course different health values. So Ryu is kind of attacking, and he has moves that may take priority over Sagat's moves, where you saw Sagat right there, he just did a Tiger Knee, which actually took priority over Ryu's Hurricane Kick. So that has to be figured out and planned to try to make the fights fair. And of course, he just threw a fireball there. So as fair as a game where you can throw fireballs is. And fighting games fighting game mechanics require you to actually look at pretty much your entire player abilities, So just my standard light punch, my medium punch, my fierce punch, and how those actually function together. And if they change if I'm close to the character, if they change if I'm far away from the character, all of those things and how they work. So I just want to give you a quick kind of mechanical breakdown of a couple of games, and then I'll be uploading a PowerPoint presentation as well that goes much further into depth of gameplay mechanics, but I felt you may be somewhat tired of PowerPoint, so I wanted to give you one with actual gameplay behind it. So that's this one. What you'll be starting on next is your actual mechanics section. So you're going to try to start building a rough draft of your mechanics section and putting that together along with your narrative section. So you'll be seeing those videos come up relatively soon, so you can get started on all of that.